Lies of P released in September of 2023. At the time of writing, we are now a little over 1 year from the game's initial launch. With the hype faded and a bit of hindsight setting in, I'm here to make the case that Lies of P is a genuine Souls-like masterpiece. Somehow, Round 8 and its parent company Nioh managed to create a game genuinely on par with anything Fromsoftware has released to date. It's a feat made all the more impressive when you consider that this studio-publisher combo not only had never made a Souls-like before, but had essentially released nothing of note prior to Lies of P. The combat, the challenge, the world, and especially the story were all thoughtfully crafted and incredibly well executed. With that being said, big claims require big evidence, and labeling a game a masterpiece is a claim as big as they come. So let's settle in and examine the reasons that Lies of P succeeded in a genre saturated with so many soulless imitations. Just one word of warning, this video will include spoilers for the entirety of Lies of P, along with some general discussion of pretty much every other Souls-like out there. Understanding what made Lies of P successful requires understanding something about what makes almost any piece of popular fiction successful. Consider David Cronenberg's The Fly. It's a terrible romance movie, but it just might be the best body horror film I've ever seen. What about John Wick? As a historical drama, it's awful, but as an action movie, it's arguably the most well-made of the 2010s. My point here is to highlight an important underlying principle. The quality of most popular fiction is not measured by any objective metric. When it comes to popular fiction, success is largely measured in how well any piece of content lives up to and innovates on the subjective standards and norms of the genre. At a base level, a good piece of fiction fulfills the promise of genre expectations that the audience has. A great piece of fiction not only fulfills those expectations, but innovates on them in ways that are additive to what came before. And ultimately, what standards stick and which ones fall to the wayside are determined by the audience's reception to them. If you want a concrete example of this, look no further than Elden Ring. The game was good because it fulfilled the expectations for what fans had come to expect from a Soulsborne game, both in terms of combat and narrative. But part of what made Elden Ring great was that it took those existing standards and innovated on them by placing those systems within a truly open world, something that Fromsoftware had not done up until that point. This innovation was additive because it took one aspect of what players already loved, the sense of exploration and discovery, and expanded upon it. If you want an example of a piece of media failing to live up to genre and audience expectations, consider The Last Jedi. While the film should be applauded for at least trying to innovate on the Star Wars formula, especially after the very safe, soft reboot that was The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi ultimately failed with most of the Star Wars audience because it refused to give them what they came for. The people wanted a space opera filled with clearly delineated good guys and bad. They wanted an expansion of the Star Wars mythos, and they wanted to see a hero's journey. What they got was a very postmodern story that essentially attacked and deconstructed much of what the audience had come to love about the franchise. It did so by debasing the series' legacy heroes, blurring the morality of the Jedi, and deriding genuine fan excitement about existing narrative threads. Kylo Ren is speaking to the audience just as much as he is to Rey when he says,
"Let the past die. Kill it if you have to."
The point of this video is not to rant about why The Last Jedi failed with so much of its audience. The aim in highlighting these two examples is to point out that establishing any piece of popular fiction as good or bad requires understanding the essential elements of the genre it's in, and by extension, understanding what the audience is there for. Recognizing this, the next logical question for this video is, what are the essential elements of a Souls-like? Understanding what makes Lies of P so good requires understanding what makes any Souls-like good. We've got to distill down to the essential elements of the genre. What is it about these games that the player base finds so appealing? Well, as far as this video is concerned, there are 4 defining elements, with those 4 being the combat, the challenge, the aesthetic, and the narrative structure. We'll be diving into each of these in detail in the next sections. I'll be the first to qualify though. These 4 elements aren't an exhaustive list. There may be more aspects to these games that players enjoy, and my narrowing down to the 4 covered here is not meant to diminish whatever element of these games is important to you. That being said, I do believe these 4 are an accurate assessment of what the player base at large considers to be the most important. Also, for the sake of brevity and to avoid getting into a semantics argument, going forward, I'm going to be using the term Souls-like to refer to any Souls, Soulsborne, or Souls-like game, regardless of whether the game was developed by Fromsoftware or not. So with that out of the way, let's jump in. The first essential element of any Souls-like is the combat. The combat is really the heart of these games and is usually the first thing that signals to a player that the game is a Souls-like. It's something that's discernible from just a few minutes of gameplay or a trailer alone. More specifically, I'm referring to the unique style of combat that Souls-like games employ. Souls-like combat incentivizes players to be extremely intentional with their actions by locking the player character into animations. This animation locking, as I refer to it, forces players to really commit to their attacks before acting. As even the most novice Souls-like enjoyer knows, attacking too flippantly in these games is the fast track to getting bodied and losing all of your currency. Souls-like combat is so ubiquitous nowadays that it's important to remember that this wasn't always the case. Look no further than series like Devil May Cry, Dead Rising, or Kingdom Hearts if you want some examples of what melee combat systems looked like prior to Fromsoftware codifying the Souls-like genre. I also think it's relevant to point out that Fromsoftware didn't even invent this style of combat. They simply adopted it and innovated on it. The earliest progenitor of this kind of combat is likely fighting games, though that might be a bit of a stretch. Games like Street Fighter and Tekken have utilized combat systems with startup, active, and recovery frames for decades now. And while all other aspects of these games are wildly different from Souls-likes, the seeds of intentional combat are certainly there. Really though, I believe the most direct inspiration for Souls-like combat came from the Monster Hunter series. That might be a bit controversial, but it is a hill I'm willing to die on. So let me elaborate a bit. Yes, the weapon movesets are different. The animations are different, but the core underlying combat systems are extremely similar. They both use a limited but quickly regenerating stamina bar. The potion and Estus functionality is essentially identical. Roll dodging was used as the essential means of evading. Hell, Even the tail-cutting mechanics that were present in the early Souls games were pulled straight from Monster Hunter. But most central to the point at hand is that these games made use of animation-locked melee combat, which again was not something that really even existed prior to that point, especially within the context of a 3D action RPG. It's also worth noting that the original Monster Hunter was released in 2004 to massive acclaim in Japan. Demon Souls was released in February of 2009, meaning the team at Fromsoftware had more than ample time to internalize the lessons of Capcom's Monster Hunter, while Demon Souls was still in early development. Now, this isn't to diminish any of the work that Fromsoftware has done innovating or defining the genre. Games and media in general are always a result of iterating on sources of inspiration, but credit should be given where credit is due, and I do think the origins of Souls-like combat is a criminally under-discussed topic. Look, my actual point is fairly simple. The first defining element of any Souls-like is its adherence to and execution of this specific style of very intentional melee combat. Each attack has a startup, active, and recovery phase. Different weapons have different animation lengths and damage values. But crucially, while the player is in the middle of an attack animation, they are generally locked into that animation and unable to alter the state of their character. This system, coupled with well-designed enemies, makes for extremely fun and satisfying combat, where the player must internalize their attack animations and understand their opponents to effectively overcome challenges. For now, let's move on to element 2. The second core element of Souls-like games is their emphasis on satisfaction through challenge. Overcoming challenges, both in games and in life, is good for the soul. But not all challenges are made equal. After all, drinking a gallon of milk in 5 minutes is certainly a challenging endeavor, but it is not at all satisfying. Souls games often employ a rhythm to their challenges, ramping up difficulty throughout a given area before crescendoing in a boss fight that serves as a test of skill. Then, the cycle repeats, just at a higher difficulty. The challenge aspect of Souls-like games generally has two distinct characteristics. One, the challenge is almost always done within the framework of the combat. The large majority of the time, the challenge does not come in the form of random tasks like solving puzzles or completing quests. It's almost exclusively a test of player competence with the combat system. Take note of how a puzzle boss like Bed of Chaos is widely considered to be bad by the Souls-like player base. This is likely because the fight totally flouts the standard they've come to expect and want. Plus it's just really incredibly annoying how it's implemented. On the other hand, a fight like Malenia, a massive, brutal skill check for most players, is considered to be good because it gives the players what they want. Her difficulty is done in service of challenging the player and giving them a sense of relief from finally taking her down. That sense of catharsis is the second core characteristic of challenge in these games, and it's only achievable through the level of difficulty the genre is known for. Let's take a minute to indulge in another relevant tangent here, as it's essential to the overall point of this video. At this point, you might be thinking, but Faust, almost all games are challenging in some way. How is challenge a defining element of Souls-likes in any way? And that's a good point. Challenge on its own is not enough to define a game as a Souls-like. In fact, any single one of these elements we're talking about is not enough to define or exclude a game as a Souls-like. Think back to the Monster Hunter example. While the combat is undeniably similar, Monster Hunter only has one or two of these core elements that make up a Souls-like. In the same fashion we wouldn't define an animal as a dog just because it has 4 legs, defining a game as a Souls-like is very much an endeavor of evaluating the sum of its parts rather than any one individual aspect. Having very intentional combat indicates that a game might be a Souls-like. Having intentional combat and catharsis through challenge is an even stronger indicator, but it's still possible the game in question isn't a Souls-like based on just 2 elements alone, as is the case with Monster Hunter. The point in taking the time to codify these elements here is that the more core elements we can define as essential to the genre, the more clearly we can delineate what is and isn't a Souls-like, and by extension, evaluate games like Lies of P as good or bad by how well they conform to and innovate on the genre standards. The third defining element of Souls-likes is their aesthetic, or the common visual theme of these worlds. In almost all of these games, the world is in a state of beautiful decay. It's something that Hidetaka Miyazaki, the primary director of the Souls games, has stated directly is a primary visual principle that FromSoft employs. The underlying beauty is not confined to any one single source of inspiration, though. There has been plenty of innovation in these games based just around applying this beautiful decay aesthetic onto different underlying notions of beauty. Whether it's medieval castles, Buddhist temples, Gothic cathedrals, Belle Epoque hotels, beauty, often expressed through the architecture, is a recurring theme within these games. Likewise, the source of decay varies from game to game, but generally, some source of corruption is slowly eroding away these worlds, be it the fading of the first flame, the dragon rot, the scourge of beasts, the surge, the shattering, or, for the sake of this video, the puppet frenzy. Starting to see the pattern here? The slow erosion of these worlds is often the primary driver moving the player forward in a narrative sense, something which is very much needed in a genre where heavy-handed exposition is generally avoided. More often than not, the player is dropped into the world in medias res, which is a fancy way of saying in the middle of the action. We enter the lands between, post the shattering, but before a new golden order can be established. We enter lore drawn as the flame is fading, but before the fire is linked. Similarly, in Lies of P, we awaken in Krot after the start of the puppet frenzy, but before any resolution to the frenzy is reached. Dropping the player into the middle of the action is not a superficial choice. It's done for good reason. It's a way of entering the player into the world without the need for heavy-handed intro exposition. To be sure, we do generally get some information about the world from intro cutscenes. But more often than not, these cutscenes detail events well before the start of the game, and often tell us very little about the immediate state of the world we are entering. Why do Souls-like games so often do this, though? Well, it's done in service of the specific way that these games convey their narratives. And that segues nicely into the fourth and final core element we're going to discuss. The fourth and final core element of Souls-like games is their emphasis on conveying their narrative through exploration and discovery. Regardless of whether the world is completely open, as is the case with Elden Ring, or more linear with branching paths, like Sekiro, these worlds are full of secrets and valuable items, not just in the typical combat sense, but in the informational sense. Players looking to progress through tough combat challenges are incentivized to explore for the sake of acquiring more powerful weapons, armor, or upgrade materials. Likewise, players seeking to increase their understanding of the world are incentivized to seek items, NPCs, and even new environments themselves, specifically for the narrative context they provide. Souls-like games limit heavy-handed exposition to an extreme degree and push the player to acquire and assemble the narrative puzzle pieces on their own. If you want to learn more about the world, You're expected to get out there and piece it together from item descriptions, environmental storytelling, and NPC dialogue. As another relevant aside, many games make use of cycles of item acquisition and increasing challenge. It's crucial to understand, though, that the specific way in which item acquisition is implemented shifts from genre to genre and is distinct in Souls-like games. Metroidvania games, for example, generally employ a cycle of item acquisition that gives the player more traversal options, and thus access to new areas of the world. For a long time, Zelda games almost exclusively followed a pattern of doling out key items that were central to the dungeon they were found in, and used in a more limited capacity after that point. Souls-like games differentiate themselves in that item acquisition is almost synonymous with narrative acquisition. Discovering new equipment scattered throughout the world not only makes the player more physically powerful, but it makes them more knowledgeable as well. Similarly, NPC side quests may reward the player with weapons or upgrade materials, but every line of dialogue has narrative significance, making them rewards in and of themselves. Let's summarize these elements real quick so that they're front of mind as we begin to discuss Lies of P itself. Souls-likes employ a specific style of very intentional melee combat. This combat, in turn, then serves as a framework for repeating cycles of challenge and catharsis. The worlds of Souls-likes are aesthetically centered around beautiful decay. The source of decay often serves as a narrative springboard to drop the player into a world full of mystery. From there, the player then engages in cycles of exploration and discovery, with a heavy emphasis on discovering the game's narrative through environmental storytelling and NPC dialogue, rather than outright exposition. As the player explores a given area, they grow stronger in terms of their equipment, skill, and knowledge about the world. The area climaxes in a boss fight that tests the combat skill of the player, and the cycle repeats. That summary is, in my estimation, probably the shortest encapsulation I can give you of what the term Souls-like means. Like I said at the top, though, there's naturally going to be some variance in opinion here. If you want to go to the mat arguing that Another Crab's Treasure is a Souls-like, I'm not going to argue with you. I might even agree with you. That game's source of decay is literally microplastics, and I think that is hilariously clever. But these four elements and this overall working definition for the term Souls-like should suffice for the purposes of this video. So now, without further ado, let's finally move on to analyzing what makes Lies of P a Souls-like masterpiece. I think the best place to begin discussing Lies of P's combat is to start by describing it relative to other Souls-like games. See, beyond the intentional aspect of Souls-like combat, there is almost always a distinct trinity of defensive options in these games. The player can block, roll, or parry. Sometimes these three go by different names depending on the game. Blocking is synonymous with guarding, rolling with dodging, and parrying with perfect guarding. But crucially, the underlying mechanic is generally very similar, regardless of the term used. It could be argued that perfect guarding is different from parrying, but it's really not. The player presses a button within a specific timing window of an opponent's attack. Sometimes you have to do it one time to open a counterattack. Sometimes you have to do it multiple times, especially with bosses. Really, the largest difference between the two is the tightness of the timing window. Either way, parrying and perfect guarding serve largely the same function. Anyways, in a game like Bloodborne, blocking is essentially non-existent. But the player does have a dodge that is massive in terms of its invincibility frames and range. If we map it out visually, it would probably sit here on the Trinity. Dark Souls, on the other hand, has a very balanced distribution of these three options. Players can opt to parry, dodge roll, or block and they're all effective strategies. Each of these three options, while viable, generally have different levels of risk-reward. Blocking puts the player into a state of recovery. Dodging allows the player to sneak in hits that they otherwise wouldn't have time for. And parrying, while being the toughest to pull off, affords the player the opportunity to get off a massive counterattack. The most relevant Souls-like for the purposes of this video is Sekiro. Sekiro sits here on the Trinity. The dodge, while present, is extremely pitiful and low range. Blocking is an option, and it certainly gets used frequently, but parrying or perfect guarding is undeniably the most incentivized option of the three. It provides the most amount of posture damage to enemies, and the active window for parrying is larger when compared to most other Souls-likes. The combat in Lies of P sits closest to Sekiro. Save for the absence of a posture meter, the combat in Lies is extremely similar. There are some minor differences in timing windows to be sure, but in terms of broad strokes, these two games are very much speaking the same language. Lies of P heavily incentivizes the player to attempt to perfect guard or parry, not just for the chance at a big visceral attack, but for the chance to break your opponent's weapons, something we'll discuss in the next section. Lies pushes the player so heavily into parrying that playing the game in the typical guard and poke style of the mainline Souls games almost feels harder than just attempting to parry. This is in large part due to two factors. First, guarding only mitigates a percentage of damage, with most weapons only blocking somewhere between 40 to 70% of incoming damage. And second, most failed parries just result in blocked damage anyways, minimizing the downside risk of parrying. Lies also employs a battle back system similar to the one found in Bloodborne, but this time called guard regain. Upon taking damage while guarding, the player has a limited window to win back some of that lost health through dealing damage to enemies. The system worked well in Bloodborne, and it's no different here. Its purpose, beyond the obvious health benefit, is that it encourages the player to be active in the combat, rather than turtle into a more defensive posture. It's also another incentive to encourage the player to attempt to parry, as health lost through mistimed perfect guards can frequently be won back with follow-up attacks. This discussion of combat is a good place to talk about the weapon assembly system that Lies of P employs. Like I said at the top, great games innovate, and the weapon assembly system is a great example of that. Essentially how it works is, weapon blades and handles can be upgraded independent of one another. They can also be interchanged at will by visiting the central hub. The handle determines the weapon moveset and stat scaling, while the blade determines the raw damage, range, and seemingly the timing, along with some other factors like block mitigation. What this means is that if you like a certain moveset, you can retain that moveset while changing the blade to better suit the enemies you're fighting. This is extremely useful in taking advantage of elemental and damage type weaknesses. It also means that, while you keep the same handle, all weapons scale well with your preferred stat attribute. It's a brilliant system, and while it doesn't solve all the issues with Souls-like weapons, you're still going to be upgrading a lot of blades for the raw damage. It does allow for very fluid and versatile weapon selection. This feels like a good time to transition into talking about the challenge aspect of Lies of P. And well, it's certainly there. At the time of its release, there was a sizable amount of chatter centered on the claim that Lies of P was actually too hard. This was something that occurred when Sekiro was released as well. Having discussed the similarities between these two games, I think it's easier to speculate on why these criticisms have been so common. Unlike in the Dark Souls series, not all defensive options are made equal in Lies of P. The board is heavily slanted towards getting the player to perfect guard, and while fighting against this slant is certainly possible, it's frankly not very fun to do. I would know from firsthand experience. For full disclosure, the first time I played through Lies of P, I played using summons and attempted to block and poke my way through the game, in a style similar to what I usually fall back to in the Dark Souls games. In my second playthrough, I used no summons and focused on improving my parry timing. What I found doing this little A/B test was that parrying was not only more fun, but once I was over the initial learning curve, it actually made the combat much easier. Suddenly, bosses were much more manageable because their stagger meter was building more quickly off of the parries. I was perfect guarding consistently enough to break their weapons, seriously weakening them for the rest of the fight. The bosses became much more predictable when I removed the summoned specter because they weren't fluctuating between two targets. Ultimately, I think the claims about Lies of P being too hard are really just a result of some players attempting to force a playstyle that the game and many of its systems are encouraging you not to do. Anyway, rather than dote on that critique, let's talk about what Lies of P gets right in how it approaches challenge. As we discussed earlier in this video, the goal of any good Souls-like is to present a level of difficulty that leaves the player feeling a sense of catharsis after overcoming a boss. Lies certainly has that in spades. Save for a few of the more repetitive humanoid mini-bosses, each major boss presents a sizable challenge to players progressing through the game for the first time. The typical cadre of boss archetypes is all represented here. Big slow bosses, little fast bosses, multi-stage fights, and multi-enemy fights. This is a totally subjective statement, but Lies has a few boss fights that have made the top of my list for my favorite in any Souls-like. But really, what makes the challenge in Lies of P so enjoyable is its introduction of a few new combat mechanics that really amplify the tension and by extension the catharsis in each fight. The first of which is the inclusion of a weapon durability meter. This isn't the typical vendor-based durability repairs that were present in some of the earlier Souls games. In Lies of P, repairing your weapon happens mid-combat. If anything, it functions more akin to sharpening in Monster Hunter. Sharpening, for the most part, is irrelevant when progressing through a given level, but in boss fights, it becomes an interesting meter to manage. Almost every boss fight lasts long enough that weapon durability becomes a major concern at some point or another. It presents the player with an interesting conundrum. Continue burning down the boss, or take the next opening to repair. It's a system that serves to ratchet up the tension in fights that are already running hot. The second spin that Lies combat employs is its stagger system. See, just like Sekiro's posture, stagger is built up on enemies over the course of a fight through attacking and parrying correctly. Once an enemy has hit their stagger limit, their health bar will flash white, indicating they can be fully staggered and opened up for a visceral attack. What makes this system interesting is that enemies are not left in this vulnerable state for very long. The player is put on the clock to land a heavy attack before the time limit is up, and their health bar returns to normal. This is also another clear nudge by round 8 that they want the player very active in the combat. It's another facet of these fights that makes them so intense. There is nothing quite like being given the opportunity for a stagger when you're out of healing items. It presents the opportunity to recharge one of the pulse cells, but only if you're willing to risk getting in the mix and trying to land a heavy attack. The final twist to the level of challenge in Lies of P is its weapon break system. As I've made reference to earlier in this video, Perfect guarding enough times will eventually result in your opponent's weapon shattering. This leaves the boss in a permanently weakened state, often with less damage, a shorter range, and even unable to use certain attacks. I cannot stress enough the level of satisfaction present in finally breaking the weapon of a challenging boss. It's something that I found was only outstripped by finally taking down the boss itself. Weapon breaking is far and above one of my favorite innovations in any Souls-like, and it's something I would love to see other games in the genre emulate. I will restrain myself from making a Monster Hunter part breaking comparison here, but just know Monster Hunter did it first. Sharpening, stagger windows, and weapon breaking. What is the through line in all three of these things? Each one of these systems serves to enhance the level of challenge in Lies of P. Combat in Lies is more than just defending, attacking, and healing as it is in other Souls-likes. With the inclusion of these systems, the level of challenge, tension, and ultimately satisfaction is turned up to an extreme in any given boss fight. They are prime examples of how innovation can turn a good combat system into a great one. Rather than just ramble about how Lies of P achieves an aesthetic of beautiful decay, let's just take a beat to look at some of the prime examples within the game itself. The visuals convey that point better than I ever could. Really, what I want to talk about in this section is the way that Lies of P innovates on that Souls-like visual trend. There are two primary sources of inspiration that Lies draws from to bring new ideas to the table. The first is the Belle Epoque period of French history, and the second is, as the title of the game implies, the story of Pinocchio. That being said, I think the Belle Epoque is utilized almost exclusively for the visual themes of the game, while Pinocchio is utilized more on the narrative end. As such, this aesthetics discussion will focus solely on how the game integrates this era of French culture into the Souls-like formula, and I'll save the discussion of Pinocchio for the narrative section. Belle Epoque literally translates to the beautiful era in French, as if my harping on beauty as a center point of Souls-like design wasn't explicit enough. The term refers to a period of French history from 1871 up to the outbreak of World War I in 1914. This time period also lines up with the Second Industrial Revolution in Europe more broadly. This era was something of a renaissance in and of itself for France. This was an era of steel and steam, but also high art and high fashion. If you want a quick visual touch point, Georges Seurat's A Sunday Afternoon on the Isle of La Grande Jatte was painted during this period, and very much captured the vibe that was present at the time. The Grand Exhibition in particular stands out as one of the primary examples of how Round 8 took the visual motifs of the Belle Epoque era and weaved them into Lies of P in contextually relevant ways. For historical context, the 1900 World's Fair was held in Paris during this era, and seems to be the inspiration for the Grand Exhibition. The real-life World's Fair was meant to be both a celebration and demonstration of new advancements in technology. The gramophone, talking films, and dry cell batteries are just a few examples of the innovations on display to the world for the first time at the Paris Fair. It is no coincidence that the gramophone in particular makes an appearance in Hotel Krat. Within Lies of P, the Grand Exhibition is essentially a dark mirror version of what the World's Fair actually was. Frenzied puppets roamed the halls of the exhibition, and alchemists hopped up on Ergo, square up to P on site. Rather than being a celebration of technology, the Grand Exhibition stands as a monument to technological innovation run amok. Now, I had originally intended to cover the Vanini Works area of the game, as I do believe it does a good job of capturing the industrial aspect of the era. To be sure, Round 8 still works their magic here by recontextualizing what would have been a steel mill in real life into a puppet factory with more overall narrative significance. But to be honest, the Vanini Works is not that interesting of an area beyond that point. The Estella Opera House, on the other hand, is an area worth spending some time talking about. This is the Palais Garnier. It was the premier opera house in France during the Belle Epoque period, having only just opened in 1875. This is the exterior of the Estella Opera House. While it's not identical, there are certainly many parallels to be found here, specifically in the use of angels and a prominent central dome. But let's take a look inside at the interior foyer of the two structures. Here are the side hallways, and here is a side-by-side view of the auditoriums and stages. While some of this can be chalked up to opera houses being opera houses, the Second Empire style inspiration is certainly there. Knowing that Romeo, the king of puppets, is the boss of this area, you can probably guess where he got his namesake. What you might not know is Charles Gounod's opera adaptation of William Shakespeare's classic Romeo and Juliet premiered in 1867 and was performed throughout the 1900 World's Fair, though it was performed by another opera company, not the Palais Garnier. Also, as a side note, you may be familiar with Gounod for his most famous work, Faust. So, you know. In all of these areas, I bring up these examples not to just point out that they are there, but to demonstrate that Lies of P is so much more than just another Souls-like clone. The level of forethought and creativity is laudable, not just for the inclusion of these visual elements, but for the way in which they're woven into the fabric of the game's world. Now, I could keep going through aesthetic examples, and I'd like to, but for the sake of brevity, I think I should move it along to the next section. This script is already 6,000 words, and I know the narrative portion is going to be the longest of the four. The narrative of Lies of P is really what I think qualifies it as a Souls-like masterpiece more than any other aspect. Lies does something that no other Souls-like has really accomplished to date. It provides its main character a clear, well-constructed, and nuanced character arc. I mean, provided the player achieves the true ending. That being said, even the lesser endings provide some amount of narrative closure. They're just, well, the bad endings. What's so impressive about Round 8's work here is that Lies still manages to provide that sense of narrative exploration and discovery that's so intrinsic to the Souls-like genre. There's plenty of lore to piece together and puzzle out, but as the game progresses and the player becomes more knowledgeable about the world, Lies makes the smart choice to lean less and less on narrative ambiguity. The game is not afraid of making a coherent thematic statement. This is an innovation in itself. It's hard to think of other Souls-likes, even Fromsoftware ones, that manage to accomplish this as well as Lies does. While there's always a sense of narrative completion to these games, there is almost never a sense of personal development for the player character. In most of these games, you're some nameless undead, a bearer of the curse, a hunter, a tarnished. The player character is essentially a replaceable vessel, one who is only really there to see through the completion of the broader world's narrative. The only Souls-like that I can think of that actually attempts to give some personal characterization to the main character is Nioh. That being said, Nioh still kind of fails in that regard. William Adams gets some characterization, primarily due to the fact that he is based on a real-life individual. But beyond that initial premise of him being a stranger in a strange land, he has no real character development. His personal story was so irrelevant and non-existent that he was even removed as the player character in Nioh 2. What Lies of P gets right is not simply that it had a character with personal development. The game is so impressive because it is able to have that development while pulling in and reimagining a 150-year-old children's story in a way that blends so well with Souls-like design principles. It finally feels like the right time to really dive into how Lies of P adapts the story of Pinocchio. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time running through and discussing different adaptations of Pinocchio, as it's neither important nor relevant. What is important is to understand the broad themes of the Pinocchio story. At its core, Pinocchio has largely been a story about growing up and taking on responsibility. It was originally a story aimed at children, particularly young boys, and was meant as an allegory for the transition between childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. Becoming a real boy was simply a representation of becoming an adult, with puppethood being associated with children's naivete and lack of independence. That's really all the context one needs to fully appreciate what Round 8 created. Lies of P takes a more universal bent on the classic story. Rather than being a story about becoming an adult in a narrow sense, Lies is a story about becoming human more broadly. Indulge me in spelling it out here, because I think it's essential to clearly get this idea across. It is, in my mind, the most important thing to understand about the narrative of Lies of P. The original story focused on Pinocchio becoming a literal human or a real boy as an allegory for becoming an adult. In Lies, that allegorical aspect is largely stripped out. It's a more literal narrative, to be sure, but the story is arguably more profound for it. I say this because examining what it means to be human is certainly a more universal theme, and to me more interesting, than just examining what it means to be an adult. Ultimately, Lies of P is a story about a puppet becoming human by being human. That is to say, P becomes a literal human by demonstrating humanity throughout the course of the game. To understand more clearly what I'm getting at, we kind of have to talk about the lie system within the game. See, I don't consider myself a smart man, just sort of a persistent one. During my initial playthrough of the game, I was faced with the first opportunity to lie at the front doors of Hotel Krot. Choosing to tell the truth results in P being unable to enter the hotel and thus progress forward in the game. Within the context of the in-game universe, only humans are capable of lying. It's something that puppets cannot do. For the life of me, I could not figure out why I had to lie here. I was very locked into the preconceived notion that the game was going to have a very binary and obvious truth and lie system, where lies were bad and the truth was good. It was only later that I realized this interaction was trying to teach me something relevant to the rest of the game. Lying is a necessary part of being human, both literally and figuratively. But let's not get it twisted. This isn't the game endorsing lying in a broad sense. It's more nuanced than that, as I'll demonstrate with some examples. As the player progresses through the game, they are presented with various opportunities to lie or to tell the truth. Whether or not P's hidden humanity stat increases depends on what action the player chooses. Again, though, it's not as simple as lying makes him more human. Really, it's the rationale and context behind each choice that determines whether or not P becomes more human from these interactions. Let's run through a few examples to show you what I mean. After being tasked with retrieving a baby for a woman in Krot who is going blind due to the petrification disease, P eventually finds a doll that fits the description the woman gave. Upon returning it to her, P can either lie and tell her the baby is cute, or bluntly state that he just gave her a doll. Lying to the woman is the only option that rewards humanity. This is because the lie is done out of compassion. Likewise, when Antonia, the elderly owner of Hotel Krot, asks P whether or not he still sees any resemblance between her and a large portrait of her in her youth, the player is faced with a similar choice. Lying and reassuring Antonia is the only outcome that rewards humanity. Telling her the resemblance is no longer there does not. The next two examples are interesting ones. At the tail end of Eugenie's story, P is faced with a choice. Lie to her about her brother and let her live in blissful ignorance of his fate, or present her with the hard truth that he was the original Alidoro and that he cared for her deeply, but distanced himself from her for her own protection. In this case, regardless of what the player chooses, both options grant humanity. Lying for the sake of Eugenie's peace of mind, or respecting her enough to share with her the hard truth, are both seen as human responses. One of the most important choices P makes in the game is deciding Sophia's fate. Upon discovering her body on the Isle of Alchemists, P is faced with giving her peace and thus ending her life, or letting her live regardless of the terrible state that her body is in. Interestingly, both options give P humanity, but opting to give her peace is required to see the game's true ending. Only once P demonstrates the willingness to help relieve Sophia's suffering is he permitted to become fully human. I believe the underlying aspect being tested here is mercy. I should also note that there are other activities within the game that reward humanity, and these activities also have some underlying rationale for why. Using the pray emote at the altar outside of St. Frangelico's cathedral rewards humanity because it demonstrates faith. Listening to music at the gramophone in Hotel Krot does the same, seemingly because enjoyment of art is seen as a human endeavor. What's important to take note of here is that all of these interactions aren't just about the characters themselves. Antonia's side quest, Sophia's, Eugenie's, these stories aren't just there to further those characters' narratives. Each and every one is an opportunity to further the story of P himself. They are all ultimately relevant to the character arc he is on. Having a player character with actual personal development, let alone development that weaves itself into the narratives of every other side character, is something that I have yet to see any other Souls-like even come close to. Hell, even most games, broadly speaking, fail at creating a complete and compelling character arc. All of this, though, brings us to the discussion of the game's finale and its endings. I'm not going to spend much time talking about the alternate endings because, frankly, I don't think they're canon. The bad ending has P surrendering his heart to Geppetto, who takes it to revive Carlo, his deceased son. The good ending, or really the middle ending, has P refusing to give his heart to Geppetto and having to fight the nameless puppet. After defeating the puppet, Geppetto ultimately sacrifices himself to save P/Carlo's heart, but still refuses to see P as anything more than a mere puppet. The true ending, also referred to as the Rise of P ending, is where the real discussion is. The Rise of P ending plays out essentially the same as the middle ending. Geppetto sacrifices himself to save P from the nameless puppet, but as he is dying, P sheds a tear over his dying father. Seeing this, Geppetto, with his final words, acknowledges P as both his son and a fully fledged human. The scene then cuts to P leaving Manas's area, where he finds an inactive puppet of Sophia. P then grants Sophia some portion of his ergo, reviving her and seemingly collapsing from exhaustion in the process. The final shot shows P twitching slightly in the arms of Sophia, demonstrating to the audience that he is still alive. Now, I'll be honest here. I think this ending serves as the perfect capstone to an already stellar game. That being said, the ending is only perfect to me if interpreted in a certain way, in a way that surprisingly does not seem to be the most common interpretation for the player base at large. The common interpretation of this ending seems to be that P, upon gifting Sophia a portion of his ergo, collapses in her arms due to the exhaustion of fighting Manas and the nameless puppet. Crucially, though, he's not dead, he's just tired. If I really wanted to steelman this view, this interpretation of the ending is supported by two facts. P really does shudder slightly in Sophia's arms during the final shot, signifying that he is alive after all. The other fact to consider is that this sequence of events actually does somewhat parallel the original Carlo Collodi story, where Pinocchio selflessly gives up 40 pennies, his currency, to help cure a sick and ailing blue fairy. She then, in turn, transforms him into a real boy. The thing is, this interpretation diminishes the meaning behind the game's ending and really undercuts the game's running themes. See, I believe P really does die when giving his ergo to revive Sophia, because his self-sacrifice is actually essential to the game's overall point. As I detailed earlier in this section, the main question posed by this game is, what does it mean to truly be human? All of P's actions throughout the game aim to answer this central question. Each side quest highlights a different facet of humanity: empathy, compassion, faith, loyalty. And while I call these activities side quests, engaging in these narratives is actually essential to seeing the game's true ending. The real question is, what would logically fit for an ending to a game with these themes? Well, it would be to ask, what is the ultimate act of humanity? It is here that it becomes apparent why P dying in the final scene is so important. That's because the ultimate act of being human is selfless sacrifice in service of others. Think about it. Which interpretation seems more in line with this theme? P simply giving up some ergo to revive Sophia, or giving up his life? Now, I'm not just engaging in baseless speculation and theory crafting here. Let's look at what evidence there is for P actually dying in the final scene. Along with P's death being a better narrative fit, there is one extremely large visual clue present in the final scene. Take a look at the pose that P and Sophia are in. If you're a religious person or just a fan of art history, you might recognize it. It is a recreation of the Pietà, a visual theme in Christian art depicting Jesus in the arms of Mary post-crucifixion. This icon originated in Germany in the 14th century and has been recreated countless times since, with the most famous recreation being Michelangelo's sculpture, which resides in St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican. Why does Lies of P evoke this iconography here? Is it simply that it looks cool? Or is there an underlying message being conveyed? Answering that question requires understanding a central point of the Christian faith. What is the story of Christ's crucifixion, if not a story about ultimate self-sacrifice? The use of this iconography is meant to draw a parallel between one story of self-sacrifice and another. The use of such a revered piece of Christian iconography honestly doesn't even make much sense if P is simply tired or exhausted, as is the popular view. With that established, there's still one important thread left to address. How is P clearly alive at the end? Well, the same way he's alive every time he dies. It's mentioned throughout the game, but it is easy to miss. P's revival from the very first scene of the game is due to Sophia. Manus even states this explicitly as the in-game rationale for why P is able to return every time he dies. I think it's more justifiable when taking these factors into account that P really does die in that final scene. He's just resurrected by a newly resurrected Sophia after sacrificing himself for her. This interpretation makes much more sense within the overall narrative and serves as a really logical final statement to the game's themes. I mean, it could also be that they just wanted him alive for the DLC and sequel, but, that's a little less fun. At just shy of 9,000 words, this video has transformed into an absolute monster. And if you've made it to this point in the video, just know I appreciate you for entertaining my unadulterated yap fest. Before we close out, let's recap the overall point I've been trying to get across. I believe Lies of P is one of the best games made this decade. This is something I believe will become more apparent as time goes on. Making this video was really just my way of trying to nudge along that recognition a little faster. The combat, the challenge, the aesthetic, and especially the narrative are all masterfully crafted with an attention to detail that most games never even aspire to, let alone achieve. Lies is an undeniable masterpiece of the Souls-like genre, and in my mind, it surpasses even some of the efforts made by Fromsoftware themselves. But really, there's no need to play the comparison game here. It's better for everyone that more games like this exist, and Round 8 should be applauded for creating such an amazing piece of art. Honestly, it just leaves me so excited for what comes next. The post-credits scene of Lies teases an expanded universe, explicitly making reference to Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz. But Round 8 has stated even more recently that both a DLC and a sequel are on the horizon, likely for 2025. Only time will tell where they choose to go with this series, but it goes without saying that I will be rooting for their continued success. I appreciate you watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.